I grew up in Glencoe, Illinois, the first 13 years of my life. And if you don't know what Glencoe is a whole world. It's just north of Evanston, and it's right on the lake. I grew up east of Sheridan Road. That's also a whole other world. And I'm very grateful for the access that I had by virtue of that. But I fairly early realized I was sort of an alien in that land. Like there was something about me that just didn't quite fit in. It was like the girls would show up wearing Keds, and I would show up wearing tree torns. They would show up wearing blue jean shorts, and I would show up wearing green jean shorts. They would show up wearing a Land's End jacket, and I would show up wearing an acid wash jean jacket. Then they would show up wearing tree torns, and I would show up wearing green cowboy boots. And it was like I just, something was never quite right in the pocket. So when I got pregnant at 18, in some ways perhaps that was not a surprise to anybody. But I realized, perhaps unconsciously at the time, that in order to get safety, security, approval, and control, that I needed to learn how to play the game. And so I very swiftly decided that I could no longer major in voice in college, and then I needed to change that major to business. And everyone that I grew up with, as far as I could see through my lens of perception, was going to undergrad, in many cases grad school, and then would work at places like Goldman Sachs or McKinsey. And so it seemed to me that in order to satisfy my need for safety, security, approval, and control, that I should try to recreate that path. So I had an aunt that worked at First Chicago, and I started working in banking. And as you've heard me say before, I was working in retail loan operations. And it was clear that I was not going to be able to support my family the way I needed to in that environment at that rate of pay. So I found myself in the broker-dealer side of the bank, in what became Bank One Investment Services, later to become Chase. And I spent many years in the broker-dealer and investment banking and private wealth management. And in 2006, I met a guy when I was working at Bank of America, and he was heading up the retail end of the bank for Bank of America. Bank of America had just brought its retail presence to Chicago, and it was about to acquire LaSalle, and they were setting up shop here. And I was so enamored by this man. And I thought, I don't care what he's doing, I know I want to work for him. Have you ever come across someone, you're like, doesn't matter to me what they're doing on the planet, I'll go with them? He was one of those guys. I remember talking to a family friend, and he said, I just want to advise you against going to the retail bank. It's the armpit of the bank. And as I think about that, there's a huge subtext. So the private wealth management side of the bank is the desirable side of the bank. The retail bank is the armpit of the bank. So that means those of you who go to your local Bank of America on the corner are the armpit, and those of you that can call your guy and make things happen are in some other class of humanity. And it didn't mean a whole lot to me at the time. I just knew I wanted to follow this guy. And so I started managing Bank of America retail locations, and I managed the largest most successful banking center in Chicago, which was at the corner of North and Harlem. We did like 25,000 transactions a day. And, sorry, a month, just to clarify that. I was very busy. And one of the things I loved to do there was manage tellers and bankers, because it was really like a training and development opportunity, and that's why I loved the retail bank. I left the retail bank and Bank of America in 2009. In 2011, I found myself pregnant without maternity coverage, which I had sort of a history of, finding myself pregnant without maternity coverage. It was always like, what the heck just happened? So I swiftly called Bank of America and I was like, hey, your girl wants to come back. And they were like, really? I was like, yes. And they're like, great, you can manage Bank of America Aurora. Okay. So I would drive an hour plus to Bank of America Aurora. And about 3 months after I got to that location, there was a personal banker there by the name of Sylvia. And Sylvia was a top producer. She was an incredible, incredible person to witness, just a magical way of being with humans. And about 3 months after getting there, she came in one day very distraught. And she said, Lola, I don't think I can function today. And I said, what's going on? And she said, my husband has been here for 15 years. He has paid taxes every year of 15 years, and he's being deported. And I was like, what? And all of a sudden, you become related to someone differently in a moment. All of a sudden, you're not there to sell widgets. All of a sudden, it's a real human being who has 2 children, whose husband has contributed greatly to their community, and he is being exited out. So I thought about that this week because a handful of us went to Emmanuel Congregation, a synagogue on the north side of the city. And a guy named Rabbi Craig Morantz leading a conversation with Alderman Harry Osterman on immigration reform. And I've been sitting with, how do we discuss immigration? And what I know for me is that I need not speak about something until I have it worked out in my being. Otherwise, I become like a landmine. So, I want to share a couple things because I think what we're being called to at this time on the planet is a reclamation of our humanity. I think there is, we have become a highly transactional society, and we have forgotten the presence of life that lives in every being we encounter. So I want you to hear this, not because you may have a deep interest in immigration, but because you are a community of people that has a deep interest in humanity. In 2015, the IRS received 4.4 million income tax returns from workers who don't have Social Security numbers. Included in that is a large number of undocumented immigrants. That year, they paid $23.6 billion in income taxes. And as we sat at Emmanuel Congregation, the evening was hosted by Alderman Harry Osterman and Rabbi Craig Morantz. The speakers were the executive director of the ACLU Illinois and a very, very brilliant immigration attorney. And at the end of the evening, there was a question and answer. And I said, what is a one-liner, sir, that you can provide me with to the statement that we don't have the resources to allow all people into this country? What do I say when someone says we can't even take care of the people who are here, let alone open our borders and let others in? And this man, who is a member of Emmanuel congregation and an immigration attorney, said, let me be very clear. We want immigrants in this country. We just don't want them legally. Because if they are here legally, then they can vote. And if they can vote, then you can't not maintain a certain structure of power, authority, and influence. So he then said, there is a myth. The myth is that you can immigrate legally. No one immigrates legally to this country. People are here with a desire for a greater life. I look forward to having this man come and visit Bodie. Very, very powerful. The number of myths that he dispelled were astonishing. My intention for today is to clarify the context of today's discord in society through the realm of consciousness. That's my intention. My intention is that we really understand what a devotional practice to oneness looks like. And that we identify the ways separation reveals itself in your individual life and in our collective landscape. So I was thinking about this, and it's, when we are unconscious, fear leads. When we are unconscious, fear leads. When fear leads, our humanity leaves. We become transactional. When we get scared, fear is in charge, and our humanity has diminished. We become oriented around our survival. And really what's happening at this time on the planet, specifically in this country, is that we are wrestling for our soul. We are wrestling with our soul. There is a way in which this country was formed, and if we do not do the adequate work of reconciliation in our soul, it will perpetuate itself. That is true of your individual life. When there is unrest in your soul that you do not address, it will perpetuate itself. And you will feel like you do not have authority or dominion over your circumstances. So there's this book, it's called the Bible. And I don't know if you know this, but I always like to correct ourselves on this. It's a mythological book. It was a mythological book written by poets and philosophers. In fact, many years ago, public television did a whole documentary series establishing the qualifications of Greek mythology, and the Bible exceeded the qualifications for something to be established as a mythological text. So it's important to understand that it doesn't invalidate it. It's just an opportunity to read it with proper context. So in that book, in the very first chapter of the Hebrew Bible, then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Now, in order to really get that statement, you have to ask yourself the question, what is this thing God? What is this thing God, and who am I in relationship with it? Because if I am made after its image and likeness, then I would want to know what is true that I am made in the image and likeness of. So, Ernest Holmes writes something very powerful that I think helps us on this exploration. God tempts no man. Now, if we just ended there and you chewed on that for a lifetime. Most of us have been raised inside of a context where something outside of you is tempting you. There's nothing outside of you tempting you. God is not some externalized presence that is dangling a carrot before you and testing if you're going to pass. God tempts no man. It is a mistake to say that God tries us. God tries no man. We make our own mistakes. We suffer from our own foolishness. And we must also make our own return journey into righteousness. God was, is, and will remain the essence of life, truth, and purity. Let us enter this essence in belief and be freed from our unbelief and human mistakes. When we impose restrictions on humanity, we have lost our way. When we begin to relate to the God body, the presence of another human being, as something less than God itself, we have lost our way. That falls in the realm of human mistake, and it is our responsibility to right that. So, we operate under the supposition that God is all there is, that there is only one thing happening here, that it is the power and presence of God, that you are the individualized manifestation of it, and that everything you encounter is of a high and holy presence. That is called unitive consciousness. When we forget and we get afraid, we go into a dualistic framework and we make something other. And then we go into transaction. So when Sylvia's husband is here as a loving member of society, contributing to a tax base of which benefits he cannot take advantage of, he does not have access to Social Security. He does not have access to welfare. He does not have access to an earned income tax credit, and yet he pays. In fact, he pays more than the person who can access an earned income tax credit. He is contributing more than you and me. Now, I talked to my husband, and I said, you run a landscape design business. Do you know if all of the laborers that you subcontract to are documented? And he said, I am almost sure they are not. And if they were, my clients would be unwilling to pay what it would cost. Now, my husband does high-end landscape design, anywhere from $50,000 for your yard to $300,000 for your yard. But an unwillingness to pay a living wage is in that paradigm. So we have to ask ourselves, because we can stand against something, but if we don't understand how we're in collusion with it, then it looks like the administration is to blame. So, my point is not to create a paranoia of your existence, but my invitation is to ask you to scrutinize your choices. When you go to the dollar store, how is it that those things get to be as cheap as they are? It's collusion. Parker Palmer is a Quaker. He says, when we forget that politics is about weaving a fabric of compassion and justice on which everyone can depend, the first to suffer are the most vulnerable among us, our children, our elderly, our mentally ill, our poor, and our homeless. As they suffer, so does the integrity of our democracy. I have been told by some that they don't like it when I get political. And to that I say, you might find a different spot, because I can't not be political. And I'd like to suggest that the unwillingness to be political is a negligence of your spiritual maturation. That in fact, all the word political means is to engage in one's government. And if you think that faith communities should not be engaged in one's government, if you think that as a spiritual being you should not be engaged in one's government, that would be an absence of living a life of responsibility. We are here first and foremost as spiritual beings that understand that we are one with all that is, that there is a universal presence that binds us one to another. When we start to think that borders are real, we have lost our way. When we start to think that this is our spot, we've lost our way. In my opinion, our present administration is desperately attaching itself to the consciousness of fear under which this country was formed. It is a virus, and you do not want to catch it. You have been exposed, and you are very vulnerable. Inoculate yourself with truth and stay alive. What is a virus? It is an infective agent. It is too small to be seen by light microscopy, and it is able to multiply only within the living cells of a host. So if the virus is fear, are you a receptive host? It can't be easily detected, but it will be pervasive, and it will take over your mind, and it will organize your entire life. You have been exposed to a highly, highly destructive virus. It is called fear. And when you let it orient your life, you will start to justify the mistreatment of the God body. It is our responsibility to educate ourselves, to clarify what is happening on the planet. There is a body of work or a legislative agenda that has occurred for many decades called TPS. It has provided asylum to people at significant levels of population to have asylum in this country. It has been extended and renewed and extended and renewed because the notion of sending people to a country whereby their life would likely be threatened almost immediately would be inhumane. Oh, and by the way, the circumstances in their country, in many cases, were largely created by our participation. So in September of 2019, 50,000 Haitians will be sent back to Haiti because our present administration is not extending that asylum. That is just one drop in the bucket of tens of thousands of people from countries that are war-torn that will be sent back. Because you and I think we don't have enough to be generous, kind, and compassionate, because at some point we thought this was our spot. And you need to go. That's a challenge. My husband and I live in Oak Park. We pay $14,000 a year in property taxes. It is not inexpensive to live there. We have oftentimes thought about leaving Oak Park, but how do we leave Oak Park responsibly? We could move to Garfield Park. We could move into Garfield Park and we could sit fat and happy in there. But I have to ask myself, is that responsible for me to accelerate in an opportunistic way and displace people who've been there for decades because I can? Do you understand what I'm saying? We have to think about how our activity impacts the God body. We are intrinsically connected one to another. If I show up at Bank of America and Sylvia cannot function because her husband is about to be kicked out, which means, by the way, she can't afford her life anymore. She cannot pay her mortgage. She doesn't have enough money to pay for childcare. Her husband's going to be sent home. And if all I'm having in the conversation is, you know we need 4 checking accounts today, Sylvia, we have a problem. Why is it that we don't want people to vote? Or actually, why is it that we don't want certain people to vote? So this very brilliant man at Emmanuel Congregation, an immigration attorney, said it very, very simply. We want to maintain a white Christian society. If we do not have a white Christian society, we are at risk. That's the paradigm. That's the virus of fear, that the other is dangerous. So the question is, where have I made someone the other? Where do I absolve myself of responsibility because what am I going to do about immigration? One of the recommendations that was made is that you go and sit in a detainment or a deporting hearing or a detainment hearing. And there are a couple reasons that they suggested that. One is because public shame actually changes outcomes. And I was thinking when I heard them say that about my mentor, Jim Dethmer. And you know, we oftentimes like to say shame is not something we subscribe to here. And I would say by and large that's true, but Jim Dethmer talks about the distinction of healthy shame. Healthy shame being your conscience getting stirred, where you can no longer turn the other way. So when we are outraged, it causes a judge to think differently. That's one benefit. But the other benefit to me is sitting in a room and watching the negligence of humanity and having to sit in the feelings of that. I'm a big believer in actually feeling discomfort. My sense is if we do not feel discomfort, life does not propel forward. So I don't know what yours to do is around this, but I do know that we have a responsibility for the consciousness with which we create. I have recently been billed at a couple of different events, and unbeknownst to me and not inside of my bio, I was billed as an activist. And I was very uncomfortable with that because I think the work of activism is very sacred work. And I would not want to lump myself in a category without actually doing activist work. And I was talking to a friend of mine this week. He and I were working on a project, and he said, I have to disagree. You are an activist. You are an activist of the mind. And there is no more important activist than an activist of the mind. The work that exists today is to transform at the level of consciousness. We cannot continue to work from the outside in. Look at your own life. Whatever it is you're butting up against, if you work at the level of the problem perpetuates. If you get to the consciousness in back of the thing, shift the consciousness, rise up into a new paradigm of living, you can create a new outcome. That is the way mental science works. This is a community about mental science. This is not a community about rainbows and unicorns. This is a community about mental science. You have a creative capacity in you. None of us are at the effect of our circumstances and conditions. It is a dishonoring of your holy nature to be subject to a set of circumstances. And that doesn't mean that we aren't all in our gap. But there's something for us to do in the realm of consciousness. You have been exposed to fear, and you are very vulnerable. I have been exposed to fear, and I am very vulnerable. You must inoculate yourself with truth, and you must stay alive. You could go through this human incarnation as the living dead. You will not die physically from the virus of fear, but you can die spiritually from the virus of fear. Several months ago, we released 7 statements of belief that were inspired by the present administration's guidance, CDC word ban. And you may remember those 7 statements of belief. We cited words like transgender, fetus, science-based, evidence-based. You can look it up on our website. And there's a word that wasn't in the 7 CDC word ban, but has become sort of its own rogue word ban. And that's the word immigration. So I'm going to add an 8th statement of belief. We believe immigration is a holy quest, motivated by an intention for freedom, abundance, and peace, and must be honored with a spirit of generosity, consideration, curiosity, and welcome, realizing our oneness with all beings on the planet. This country would have a very different history if when folks came here from Spain or England, they had walked on the earth with reverence. This country's history would be very different if people had shown up with deference and curiosity, with a willingness to learn, because the spirit of the quest that resulted in colonization, there was an aspect to the spirit of that which was to leave a regime or paradigm that felt wasn't working. Yes? So folks immigrated here, colonized the land, and now want to say, you're not allowed. We are a community that believes in a paradigm of oneness. If you and I believe in a paradigm of oneness, then the woman that has her baby here, whose husband is being deported, is of deep and grave concern to me. It's not just a news story. So I want to read this one more time, and then we'll close with prayer. We believe immigration is a holy quest. Imagine you are living in an environment whereby your existence is actively threatened. In many of these cases, the identity of queer causes the environment to be fatal. Imagine you are living in a place that is war-torn. Imagine you are living in a place where you do not have adequate resources. And there's a divine idea within you that says, I believe the possibility exists for freedom. Because remember, we sold that advertisement. We sold the advertisement that says, this is the land of the free, the home of the brave. And all are welcome here. Oh, except for you. It doesn't work. In consciousness, it doesn't work. It is a breach of integrity. We believe immigration is a holy quest, motivated by an intention for freedom, abundance, and peace. Have you ever had an intention for freedom, abundance, and peace? And have you ever had someone say, you can't have that? You're not smart enough, you're not good enough, you're not great enough, you can't have that. It must be honored with a spirit of generosity, consideration, curiosity, and welcome. We must realize our oneness with all beings on the planet. Otherwise, we are doing nothing more than paying lip service. Peace and many blessings.